dearly waiting for, and I think the speaker needs introduction. Max Schrems. Welcome, Max. Thank you for taking the time. Max's schedule is very full as usual, but you've taken the time to be with us, and it's very important that you are with us. And there's good reason for the talk being Schrems II. That's not due to us. That's not to our adoration, but it's grounded in the fact that you keep influencing the rules, and well, only if the rules are stupid, just like as they are right now. I will call it the Privacy Shield case, and the previous one is the Safe Harbor case. I didn't even want for the first one to happen, but everyone's now calling it Schrems II. But it's actually shorter that way. That's very simply the reason. What Schrems II is and what it's about, you will tell us in the next 30 minutes or so, and then you'll be available for questions for 10 more minutes. Okay, welcome, Max Schrems. Thank you. One thing, because you said there's little time, I personally didn't have time to translate my slides into German, so I'll talk in German about the English slides, if anyone is surprised about that. Right. In general, the background story is that data transfers are interesting because the rule in the EU, the basic rule is that no data is allowed to get out of the EU. But then, of course, the internet happened. Things are being sent to and fro, and but the default rule is that data is not allowed to leave. But there are exceptions. There are necessary transfers and non-structural transfers. So I'm booking a hotel in New York. I'll send an email. I'm sending an email. Separate from that are the classic outsourcing situations where I move all my data to Australia, India, China, whatever, and despite the outsourcing, that's what you do with contracts too. And if you do that, you ask your subcontractor to adhere to the standards, which is possible. And on paper, this can then be done. And so there is adequacy. There are standard contract clauses. And there are binding corporate rules. And in that system, you can see which data goes where. And these outsourcing issues are where European law is practically exported to the outside world. Because we are telling others to stick to our rules, which is like, as if I would tell an organic farmer in Kenya that would normally not adhere to an European organic certification, but you can, he does not automatically underlie those rules, but you can, in a contract with that farmer, then to tell him to stick to those rules. So this is a general mechanism, not just limited to privacy. And there's this European privacy bubble in which the European companies are, but also Swiss, of course, non-EU country. They are part of the same bubble, the same construction. You don't need many specific rules. You can just transfer data. And this is the current list. So you see a lot of gray and little red. The Commission is trying to expand and getting more and more countries to kind of join or use the European system. And I think there are more than 70 countries that are more or less adhering to the European standards, but not yet sufficient to allow general data transfers. And the plan is to have more and more countries, many in South America, for example, that have the potential. The newest one is Japan, which of course is a very relevant economy, which has given itself the European standard. So in the larger Western countries, this is expanding, but the US, of course, is an exception. And in cases like that, in the US, where there is no effective privacy law, they try to then use those contract constructions where they say, okay, you don't have the law in your country, but we can, of course, enter into a contract to establish those rules. But if there is a national law in such a third country that requires companies to not stick to such a contract, you have a company such as Facebook that on the one hand is telling the Europeans, okay, yeah, privacy is great, we are signing all your contracts, but on the other hand, in the US, due to the surveillance laws there, they have to disclose the data. So they have to break one of these two legal constructions. So this is a problem about jurisdiction. One country says one thing and the other says another. And one of these one then has to be broken practically. And it will be the contract to the European company that will be broken, right? Our case has been the same for 7 years. I am an Austrian citizen who has a contract with Facebook Ireland, which has a contract with Facebook in the US. And the data, in fact, is transmitted to Facebook USA and then used by authorities, which we know from Snowden. Of course, these Snowden documents are about 10 years old by now, and we only know what is in those documents. There could be more, things could have changed, but what we know from these documents is, and what the US administration admits, is that there is an upstream branch. So the data is recorded in transit, and there is another program called downstream where the data is taken from the provider when it has arrived there. So this is useful for unencrypted transfers. But if an end-to-end encryption is in use, then you have to, of course, tap the data, use the data, get the data from the provider. In general, according to US law, you have the FISA Act, and there is an executive order that the president simply can enact with no other legal foundation. So President Trump can sign one another of these papers with a large pen and tell the authorities to do a certain thing. And these executive orders are non-enforceable. So this allows the administration to tap into a transatlantic cable, but they cannot this way compel a company to help. But FISA can compel a company to disclose data. That's the difference between laws and executive orders, which tell the executive to do something, but cannot go beyond the US government, the executive. And then you have the so-called 28 guidelines, which are a side issue. So that is the setup. And that is how the data then arrives at the NSA in the end of in practice. Things are more complex. There are 100 intermediate steps, but and a simple graphic like this is enough for a slide like this. So first we went to court because of safe harbor, saying that the surveillance laws in safe harbor violate the core protections for the core areas of life, and there was no court in the US that I could go to. So I think I've shown this slide in a previous week or even two, but for people that are new to the issue, what this might explain is that normally in law there is the proportionate requirement, proportionality, and for data retention, for example, the question was, is this surveillance, is it tracking? Compared to terrorism prevention, is that proportionate? And regarding data retention, it was clarified that this was not proportionate. But there's also the kind of core area of a basic rights, the essence. And these are the violations that are so grave that it's impossible to actually to even enter into a check for proportionality. So torture, for example, is simply not allowed. There is no way of making that proportionate. And the question whether such a core area was violated, and the European Court of Justice even said that that safe harbor violated that. And this is relevant because the difference is being made, and the second judgment is not as amenable than the first one. A few other things that I will only briefly touch upon. They explained that it's not enough for a law to exist in a third country. The law has to be enforced. And in reality, things look different often, and there has to be legal recourse that is equivalent to that in front of a European court. What in practically they said is that there are two hurdles. The first is the GDPR, or the equivalence to GDPR, and then there is the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and that has to be adhered to as well. So two hurdles that any measure has to overcome. In the US and in Brussels, many lobbyists said, okay, we only need to overcome the first hurdle. We're not even going to look at the second one because it doesn't apply. There are no basic laws in data transfers and so on. But the European Court of Justice made it very clear that both hurdles have to be overcome. And when Safe Harbor was dead, the European Commission came about with this privacy shield. And the interesting thing was that in commercial use of data, what they upgraded it somewhat, but Privacy Shield was still miles away from what a European company would have to do. So that was very unfair from a commercial point of view, because US companies were allowed to be in the European market without sticking to the same rules as the European companies have to. And with all the state surveillance debate, the thing was that they simply added a description of US law, which wasn't included in Safe Harbor. So they took Safe Harbor and then kind of explained the US law, added that, and explaining that, and the European Court of Justice simply said that they should have looked at the law rather than just describing or reviewing it. So people tried to make the public believe that the law had been looked at and that it hadn't been done. That's what the European Court of Justice said. And the interesting thing was that the necessity for legal recourse, they invented an ombudsperson, which is a subdivision of the foreign ministry, a place where you could write an email to, but not as a single citizen, but only as a central European institution. So I, as a citizen, had to go to my data protection commissioner, that had to go to the European Data Protection Board, and then they would have to write an email for the US authorities to look at the issue, and then it would go the whole way back and get a confirmation. And in that confirmation, which I did receive, it said that the US government either does not surveil you, or if they do surveil you, they hadn't broken any laws. And which of these two would actually be true, I wasn't allowed to know. And the admission that laws had been broken wasn't even included there. So even in the agreement, you could see what each individual answer would be. So that was kind of daring, but the Commission tried anyway. And I said at the beginning, this is lipstick on a pig. It's just dressing up the issue. And we then went into the second round, as it were, and it sounds great. Schrems I, Schrems II. This sounds simple, but these are extremely long procedures, and a lot of courts involved, a lot of hassle, which is all about delaying people, and extract as many concessions as possible. And the Irish authority then informed me that Facebook wasn't using safe harbor at all, but were using standard contract clauses. So the first round at the European Court of Justice was completely senseless because we used a legal foundation that Facebook apparently were not using at all. And the Irish Protection Commissioner does that a lot. They just give false information, and you take that false information to the highest court, and you then celebrate your win, and then you realize the win was on false information. And this is a kind of whack-a-mole game. Well, you tried this, but what you had to try is this, is something else. So I updated the complaint, and saying that Article 4 of the standard contract clauses would not apply, would not be legal. So if I know that there's a contract, but the recipient of the contract does not stick to that, then the European authority has to tell the European company, stop sending data there. The European authority did not understand this line of thought, and that's why we had to go to the European Court of Justice for a second time. And the resolution was because that we were natural defendants. I don't know what that means. So I wasn't the plaintiff anymore. I was suddenly turned into a defendant, as I heard. And I thought, oh, not again, please, because the extra information, the learnings from that second case would be minimal. So to invest 5 years into that is kind of dubious whether it's worth it. So we had all kind of amicus people that are helpers, including the American government, which was interesting. And that's why the US government was constantly present, and it was interesting how they argued in that case, because the US government said in the first case that the European Court of Justice had understood it all wrong, and they hadn't listened to the poor US authorities, and they had no way of influencing the case at all. The interesting thing was that the whole thing used the standard contract clauses, but Facebook in the closing part suddenly said, well, it's about Privacy Shield as well, because we are using that as well. So it went through the whole European levels. There was another call because Facebook didn't want it to go the European way. So all the member states could make six submissions. So we had a whole stack of legal procedures from all kinds of people, legal interventions, and there were two extremes. Facebook saying there's no surveillance at all, no problem, and the Irish Data Protection Commissioner said all these transmissions, the agreements are null and void, and we were in the middle saying the agreements are okay, they have to be enforced, and that was what we wanted. And the whole thing was then listened to. There was the general prosecutor, the oh, I hate PowerPoints, it's slide to the top. The interesting thing was the facts that the Irish court brought forward were the difference with the first case was they didn't say mass surveillance anymore. They said mass processing of data. And that is the only element where there was a noticeable difference, saying that not all the data that are collected by the Airstream are surveilled, but they are put through a filter, which is a processing activity to search for things like email addresses and identifiers, as they call them. And only then, when the positive result came about, would they then enter the surveillance mechanism. So that's the difference when you say that I know all the data and I'm going to process all of them, or filter them first and only then process the results. The interesting thing is that that was just a mere claim by the US government saying that they were acting in that way. It doesn't say that in US law. It could well be that they had full capture and not filtering. And there are programs that are mass surveillance, such as code travel, and so where all the data from all the mobile networks, say, are used to see who is traveling with whom. And even in the materials, we have from the US government say that there is bulk surveillance or mass surveillance. So there's a difference between what the Irish court found and what the US government were admitting themselves, which is why the European Court of Justice kind of reacted to this. And the difference here is that, yeah, surveillance is 100%, but only a certain fraction of that, they said, enters surveillance. And surveillance is not 100%. So there's a slight difference there. And the fact that all data was scanned in the Facebook case or the Prism case, the data is being made available, but that doesn't say that all the data is being downloaded. So if you have all the data available, it doesn't say that all the data has been used. And and there were very broad terms that were used. So if I have an API that can give me access to all the data, that is that making it all available? Is that processing all the data? In any case, now these slides really have a problem because there was a very, very long submission to the court. These are typical lawyers' slides. No one has to read them. They're full of text. But the Irish court really sent an endless amount of questions which were very, very badly formulated, mostly by the Irish Data Protection Commission. And so we had a very long construct of questions. But in the end, the question was, do these standard contract clauses violate fundamental rights? Are they valid? And the core arguments from Facebook were that in the US, that surveillance in the US is equivalent to that in Europe, so there's no problem. UK and others are doing the same thing, or France and Germany, as the US authorities do. So there is no larger amount of surveillance, so that shouldn't be a problem. They made a few other claims saying, I don't have to go into those. And we basically said that the Irish authority should stop the transfer of the data as the data in the US is underlying US laws. And not every US company actually is affected by these laws, only those that are called electronic communication service providers. So if I send data to Microsoft, they do underlie these laws. If I use a travel booking platform, then that company itself is not under the US surveillance law. But if they use some cloud provider, that would be, that data store might be under those laws. So you have to look at the whole chain and see which company is under which law. And that, of course, is a very, very large amount of effort that has to be made. And the US authorities said that there is a systematic problem here. All these data protection agreements, standard contract clauses, should be declared null and void. So that's what the Irish Data Protection Commissioner said, not the American. And so that was the nuclear option. And there's an argument there in the Facebook case, which was that there is a certain hypocrisy because we are so high and mighty about our rules, but in the EU contracts, that there are some exemptions to fundamental laws. The EU cannot pass laws for those. So telecommunications data retention, for example, is about national security, and that is one of those exceptions. And the question is, how far does that go? But classic national security is one of these exceptions. So that gave us the problem that the European Court of Justice finds rules about surveillance in other countries, such as US or North Korea, whatever, but they have no jurisdiction about German secret services using data. That is the standard that we have at the European level. It's very high, but it doesn't affect member states for when national security is concerned. And that is how it is, because the member states, they have the authority, they still want to make their own rules regarding national security. So what came about? What was the result? At the procedural level, the Irish Data Protection Commission, it was said, had to stop the data transfers according to Article 4 of the standard contract clauses. And that was why the media reported that we only had scored half a win, or not a complete win, because they thought the activists would want all the bad things to be made illegal. And no, if we just said that contract clauses have to be enforced, and safe and PrivacyShield has to die. And that's what the media then turned into an only half win, although actually they followed our arguments completely. Only all the journalists asked, "Oh, Mr. Schrems, how do you deal with that partial defeat?" And you then try to tell them that you've achieved exactly what you wanted, and you then said you are free to admit that you can admit that you've half lost. So that's what journalists say: have you won? Have you lost? It's all about losing or winning. And that was the most fun we had on the day, to set the record straight on that. And so the problem there was solved at the procedural level. In terms of content, a difference was made between mass surveillance and mass processing, as I said, and that led to the ECJ saying that the surveillance is not proportionate, but did not say that it violated the core area of private law. So regarding the question of going to US courts, they did say it violated the core area because there is no court, only that ombudsperson. So that simply cannot be upheld. The most important thing in practice is that the internet is not dead yet. What all kinds of people were saying on the day of the decision. And I'm saying that because the necessary data transfers are still allowed. They have always been. So lobbyists saying you cannot send emails to the US anymore if this case is won, that is not true. Outsourcing is no longer allowed, but the industry keeps doing it anyway. And there is guidance from the authorities whether they are not allowed to do that. But that doesn't seem to be enough, so the guidance has to be enforced. Otherwise, people may understand it differently, and the authorities are just being scared and not doing anything. Everyone is just standing there and waiting for something to happen, right? And the most important thing you can take away is if you have data that is non-personal, that you send it out into the world, that of course is still allowed. If you have video streams without including personal data, send that abroad. And also, perhaps quite important, I can always send my own data to a third country. If I say I'd like American porn, I'm going, that is my problem. If I use an American provider without a European branch, an American hosting provider, for example, then that is no data transfer. Then I, as a data subject, have transferred my data, not that another company transfers my data. If there are necessary data transfers, this is a slide. This slide was made before Corona, when the idea of flying to the US wasn't such a strange idea. So if I book a ticket somewhere, my data can be sent. So necessary data transfers are still allowed. What does not work is plain outsourcing to the US if the recipient is such an electronic communications provider. In practice, that is a huge problem because half of our infrastructure these days is still based in the US, or the processing takes place in Europe, but the companies in the US, that's important. So if you have Microsoft data centers in Europe, they are still affected. If it isn't the case that technically some American company can tell the US government, sorry, I cannot technically get the data from Europe because it's encrypted or whatever the technical reason is. As long as that is not the case, FISA still applies. And if so, in case the data were based in Europe, completely encrypted, and the headquarters were not able to access it, of course, you never know how safe a key is once the NSA gets to it, but that's a different issue. I have to pass on to the technicians for that. But so that is the limit of US law. And when data transfers are not applied by FISA, that's a different story.
Yeah. So everybody is adhering to that. And the EU Commission came out on day one and said they're going to get a new deal, and they had to realize that that is not really working. But they're going to try to enforce it step by step. So they create a guideline on their website, which questions should be asked. For example, as a EU company that wants to outsource some things to the US, and you, if you have to do that for your work, like using an American hosting provider, for example, there's a lot of guidance there. And there was a hearing in the EU Parliament. And the EU parliamentarians said, we have heard about this twice now. Why is it still not working? Then we were asking, like, what data is going where and which laws do actually apply to them. And if you need something to fall asleep over, there's a lot of very boring answers. So we're now coming to the enforcement. So we have filed 101 complaints, like the 101 Dalmatians, and we filed them for a lot of companies, for example, that were using or are using Google Analytics, and made sure that for every EU country we have a couple of examples, and so we have a database. So we want to make sure that companies that export data from Europe to the US take care of their responsibilities. All right. Then the DPC said that they wanted to enforce the ruling against Facebook, and that is before Irish courts. And it's like Facebook sued against the DPC, who only started the proceedings, and they so the Irish are simply too stupid to get a good description of this into the filings. So finally, we're looking at what European data exporters are actually doing and what we might be able to do directly against the companies in the US. So we can find a bridge to get a lever on these companies. That's kind of the plan right now. So the very last point. I can explain what all is problematic, but we do need a solution for all of this. And I think it's possible permanently that industry can figure out how to have free data transfer while keeping privacy. And that's kind of the idea for the entire European Union. And I think it's at least possible for the Western country. If you want our data, then you need to keep to certain rules. This is not a free-for-all. And and it's a bit like the Swiss would say, well, we want to take all your gold, and then the Swiss would turn around and say, well, but you can't have your gold back. Then of course nobody would send the gold to the US anymore. And these companies are earn a lot of money, so they should be very interested in keeping that business from companies and users worldwide. So thank you very much, and I'm getting ready for your questions, but let me put in an ad. We need another team member, a programmer. So if you know somebody who knows somebody who is interested in a tech job working for none of your business, please get in touch with me. So if you're interested in legal tech and app, so we can help enforce that and like help, for example, send out complaints automatically, build some app block technology. So that would be nice. Thank you very much, Max. You are racing through the presentation, and we are having trouble keeping up and breathing. Everything fine. Thank you very much. So as an addition, for one or two of you who don't know this, the organization NOUB, N-O-U-B, is none of your business, and it's a foundation that is trying to enforce data protection laws that are already existing, and like work against companies who try to skirt the rules or claim that they are interpreting the law quite differently. So we're in a European organization. Our internal language is English, not German. So yeah. And if you have a problem with English, so there's a good translation team working. Thank you. Like lawyering might be hard, but it's producing some very good results. And I'm very happy that you can still laugh about this after all these years. And yeah, I take this thing too seriously. I would go crazy. So here's a couple of questions. So one of the questions is, how quickly do the data protection agencies have to answer? So the EUCJ the court said that the agencies have to act on it. So far, the agencies were of the opinion that they could act if they decided themselves to do so, but the court clearly said that they have to. Otherwise, so in Austria, it's very easy. The agency has to give a reply within 6 months. And the big problem on the European level is that if I file my complaint in Austria, but the company, for example, is headquartered in Ireland, then this 6 month limitation does not apply. And in one concrete example, step 1 of 6 steps took 2.5 years. And after that, you have the court system, then it takes even longer. So if I file a complaint in Ireland, I probably will get my pension before I will see a final result of that. And so that's kind of a problem, that things get stuck in another country. Do you feel, or have you been blocked or hindered in your work so far? Was it better, easier working together with the data protection agencies? So we don't work together with agency. So, but we actually got sued by the Irish Protection Agency, and So I try to keep a very professional work relationship with the agencies, and I don't really like to work together with them. I don't think that's necessarily the role of the agencies to work together with people like us. So the more neutral our complaint is, the better the resulting ruling should be. And there are some agencies who do their work very well, and others not so much. And so and for example, the Austrian agency is not known for being very active. Yeah, we're very happy we have them. So yeah, what they do when they do it, they're quite effective. So we're very happy to be able to file in Austria, but manpower-wise, they're somewhat limited, and they're not necessarily picking up topics or cases by themselves. So it should be that the agency themselves look for violations and pick up cases themselves, but it shouldn't be necessary for us to actually do these filings. But unfortunately, in the data protection area, it's like your health office that only gets active when people start complaining about sanitary conditions. Ulrich Kelber said at the data protection conference last week in Berlin that it would be necessary a unified enforcement. So we sent out the 101 complaints very quickly, and the problem is, to a certain degree, that and everybody saying like, oh, we sent out the complaints, so we did something. And so it would be good that they would actually coordinate between themselves and work together to get criteria to verify these complaints. And so just sitting back and saying, well, we're working on these 101 complaints, but not doing anything ourselves. So I don't want to be the proponent of the agencies. Well, so the Irish agency actually has a lot of people working for it and a lot of money by now. So in Austria, the resources are really limited. So here's one more question. So the data collection of Facebook and Google, and the comparison with the gold stash in Switzerland, one big difference is that there are no network effects with storing gold. So by amassing more data, you can increase your own capabilities and power. So what does that mean? So it's a bit problematic to try to fix this after the fact. So as long as we don't have worldwide uniformed laws and rules, you might need to differentiate your products and have a European product and an American product that adheres to American law. So I'm more of a globalist, and we should be able to agree on a complete standard. And it cannot be that the one standard becomes what is the law in California. And it cannot be that not even the US as a whole, but individual states in the US write the global law. That's, of course, to do with democracy and the rule of law. And importantly, it's the main problem is that the big companies are big enough that they assume that these rules will not be enforced anyway. So if they suddenly have to pay €1 billion fine, they will come into compliance very quickly. And so these are our basic rights, and they have to be enforced. So in Austria, chicken McNuggets look differently than the ones in Germany. So apparently there are different rules for how these products are made. So then I don't understand why it shouldn't be possible to have different code for different regions. And yeah, that's leading right to one more point. And for the small and smallest companies, so they have problems with these rulings. So how can these companies work with data protection into my business? And so having to pay a big fine is a big problem for small companies. What do you recommend for small companies? So I think we need to expand the economical view. So how much do I have to pay for a server in euros? And I simply pick the cheapest, but I also need to look at the compliance, so if I pick the right company to rent my server or application from, then I spare myself a lot of headaches with compliance, and in the end, I even save money. So that might be an answer in many cases, and in other cases, I think the basic question is there's one way to read the ruling in one way. So the lawmakers and the courts are very serious about this. So if I'm redesigning my IT systems, that I can set things up from the get-go in a clean and compliant manner, instead of trying to continue working my system in a semi-compliant manner. And so one of the things, even we have our own Zoom account, simply because there are some situations where even we have to use this tool because the other parties are relying on it, and we can't do. We still need to talk to them, and it's worth nothing if you have a completely compliant system, but it actually doesn't work. So when the GDPR came into effect, you said, "Don't panic." So all this documentation. So if I'm responsible to document what I have an inventory, and there's no way around that. You really have to do that. And so just send in the questionnaire, and so they answered the questionnaire, and they said, well, we don't really fall under this law. And so you can reduce your potential fine by saying, no, I haven't actually completely skirted the regulations. I try to comply, but very luckily you're not a lawyer, and you don't know anything about this area of law. Thank you, Max. That was a fantastic experience again to listen to you. Thank you for your time. We have answered all the questions for the time being. And so hopefully we'll see each other again next year.